Anyway, good evening, everyone. My name is Louise Sue. I am the chair of the events committee of the Friends of the Canadian War Museum, and I have the pleasure this evening of introducing our speaker. But first, I would, now that I have you all online, I just want to say thank you very much for coming. We have about 39 participants tonight, which I think is just amazing. And I'm looking forward to a really great evening with you all. Tonight's speaker that I have the pleasure of introducing this evening is in fact not a stranger to the War Museum at all. She in fact started her working life right here at the Canadian War Museum. So she knows us well. She has a bachelor's degree from Carleton right here in Ottawa and has a master's of education from the University of Caen. And is presently she's led the Juno Beach Center's Summer Institute, a battlefield study tour for Canadian educators since 2011. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our speaker this evening, Maria. And hello, she should come popping up and we should be able to share her screen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to participate with the Canadian War Museum tonight. I'll begin to share my screen and walk you through my presentation, as well as take a period of questions at the end. So let's see here, making sure it's coming up and like this. Okay. So tonight's going to be basically a curator's tour inside the making of the exhibition called From Dieppe to Juno that we created at the Juno Beach Center in France for the 80th anniversary. I'm going to be walking you through as much as I can what the exhibition looks like and feels like, talking to you about some of the challenges in creating the exhibition that we faced, and as well as bringing you some highlights from some artifacts that we were able to secure, and telling you the story basically from the perspective of what it's like to create an exhibition about such a difficult topic in our Canadian military history, as well as telling that story in a European context, of course, because the Juno Beach Center is located in France, anchored, of course, on the beaches of D-Day, Juno Beach. So let me just click here. Okay, that works. First of all, I want to thank our exhibition partner as well as sponsors for the exhibition. You should know that the exhibition was co-created with the War Heritage Institute, which is located in Brussels. Partially, it has locations across Belgium, but it's essentially Belgium's Canadian War Museum. So we were lucky enough to cooperate with a fine institution in bringing some European contents to the Dieppe story for that exhibition, as well as some of our sponsors, which come from the state of France at the regional and federal levels, as well as Seaspan Shipyards, which is a Canadian shipping company. So just wanted to highlight that before we start. Tonight I'm going to be reading a lot of quotes because that is what the anchor, the main anchor of the exhibition is, voices and quotes. We face the challenge of telling a very Canadian story to your European audience, as I said, and we also face the challenge of telling the story of Dieppe to people who know nothing about it. And that's where we came from with creating the exhibition, not an exhibition for experts, but an exhibition for those who know nothing, are not familiar with military history, and are even less familiar with the concept of a raid. So one of the most important quote that guided us in the making of this exhibition is this one with someone we all know very well tonight, Tim Cook, who says, "The shell stones at Dieppe, some the size of a small fist, offer unsettling sound as they rub against each other. Footing is poor, the rocks move with pressure. The memory of Dieppe is like these stones layered upon each other, shifting unsteadily and disquieting. This is unsettled history, and yet it also dominates. The memory of Dieppe overshadowed the story of Canada's Second World War for much of the 20th century. So this quote actually welcomes visitor, and it has also just one of those famous church stone standing alone in a case, along with this image of helmets that, you know, speaks to you. You know, an image is worth 1,000 words, so it speaks of failure right away. So just as we headed into making this exhibition, the adventure started about 2.5 years ago, and it was embedded with research that lasted about a year. Of course, what we discovered in the process of the research is that Dieppe is a layered story, much like Tim Cook says. It has ripple effects through time, at the time, and also much after the Dieppe Raid. And what we wanted to showcase was the plurality of the voices of Dieppe. We wanted to make sure that the diverse types of people would get visibility in the exhibition, which is always a challenge. I should mention the exhibition space is roughly 150 square meters. That's not even 1,500 square feet. So we had a small space to fit a complex story. So we decided to divide it up as such, zone 1 to 5, zone 1 being the context, and I'll be walking you through each of the zones individually tonight as I guide you through my presentation. But first of all, let's go back to some of the obvious aspects of Dieppe. It's a failure, it's a disaster. To a European audience, it's basically, for the French, it's our Verdun. For Anzac troops, it's our Gallipoli. It's our first day of the Somme. It's a day where we experience anywhere from 60% to almost 80% losses. So I'll go over the numbers again just to earmark that. We had 4,963 Canadians who went. 2,210 of them managed to return to Great Britain, of which 568 were wounded. The result of the Dieppe Raid is also 1,946 prisoners of war, 100 of which died of their wounds. And of course, it's 907 Canadians killed in action. So the exhibition is comprised of the usual exhibition ingredients, you know, biographies, quotes, text, photographs, artifacts, iconography, and especially infographics to try to make a complex story as limpid as possible. So let's dive into the context of 1940 to 1942. We had a number of goals in making sure that our visitors would understand where the Dieppe Raid comes from and the reasons that were posited for carrying out the raid, such as appeasing Stalin, forcing German reinforcements on the coastal area, and of course, drawing out the Luftwaffe, responding to American pressure for a second front in 1942, empire building actions, most importantly, testing enemy defenses and combined operations techniques, including the destruction of heavily defended deep water ports, raising Allied morale, so a propaganda raid, which I'll get to later, gathering intelligence to support the naval intelligence war, and pinching operations during raiding. So we were after these ambitious objectives for visitors to understand. And let's go into the context of Zone 1. So of course, what we had in mind in creating this section before we even talked about the raid was making sure that people would understand that the Dieppe Raid is more than just hurling a bunch of infantry alone against gigantic cliffs, to bring a more nuanced and complex story to the Dieppe Raid. There is a logic to raiding. that we establish in the exhibition as best as we can. We follow the strategy given the specific context, which is the Atlantic Wall and the Battle of the Atlantic. That image speaks for itself, by the way. It's in just shortly before the Dieppe Raid in July of 1942, when combined operations represented by the three soldiers from the Army, Navy, and Air Force, Royal Air Force, are asking Churchill to go on an outing to Europe. Of course, in bringing some of the voices to the exhibition, we tried to narrow it down to one quote per key figure, which is not an easy task. With Winston Churchill, we wanted to establish that as early as 1940, the idea of going down the coasts, the occupied coast of Europe, especially France, for butcher and bolt operations or hit and run operations are really clear and foremost, not in 1942, but in 1940. Okay, so we have some large maps in the exhibition which describe that Atlantic Wall, which also describe other successful operations to again reinforce that notion that the Dieppe Raid did not come out of nowhere. It was the continuation of a logic of raiding, which had been successful on various places that you see in yellow dots, especially regarding Bruneval Raid and Saint-Nazaire Raid between Brittany and Normandy, who were two highly successful commando operations that led combined operations to think that they could conduct bigger raids on coastal France. Of course, the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942 is a really important aspect to understand. It has a direct relationship with the Dieppe Raid, and we wanted to make that clear in the exhibition. The numbers here are quite striking. So in gray, you have the amount of merchant ships that were hit every month during the year of 1942, and opposite to that, you have the small disproportionate figures for the numbers of U-boats that we managed to sink during the Battle of the Atlantic. So the year is more than alarming. And the relationship with Dieppe here is relating to naval intelligence, of course. When pinching operations can occur, intelligence material can be gathered and, of course, contribute to code breaking, and especially tied around the Enigma usage of electromagnetic communications, the famous encrypted German communication system. So the blackest period for the Battle of the Atlantic corresponds to the period from February 1942 to October 42, where we actually have a complete blackout in decryption capacities, and it corresponds to these horrendous losses at sea, obviously. So the need to have more operations that can pinch materials from intelligence for intelligence purposes, taking prisoners, such as one of the objectives for the Dieppe Raid I'll get to later on, becomes really clear, and we wanted to establish that first and foremost. Of course, let's go through what some of the key figures say about the Dieppe Raid. Again, keeping in mind we had the space to provide about one quote per major key players. Here they are. So for Mountbatten, of course, what is foremost in his mind is the actual eventual invasion, but in the meantime to carry out commando raids to keep the enemy on the qui-vive on the coast. And then for Curator, we chose this one. It will be a tragic humiliation if American troops get into action before Canadians who have been waiting in England for 3 years. So that gives visitors a sense of the thinking at the time, why Canadians being used as opposed to British troops, for instance. We tried to make that clear. One of the things that we also wanted to make sure is that not just some high-ranking key figures would be quoted in the exhibition, but your regular soldiers. So here we have a really amazing quote that actually welcomes visitors into the raid zone. It's the advice of a British commando to a gunner, a Canadian gunner of the Royal Canadian Artillery, who says, "I've been on several commando raids, and you want to pick your spot on the boat. Either be among the first 5 men to get off or the last few men. If you're in the first 5, the enemy seems to be taking aim before they open on you. If you're in the last few, it seems about that time they're either changing magazines or getting fresh ammunition, and the last 3 or 4 men always seem to get away scot-free," which gives a sense of the brutality of what the Canadians would eventually be facing before the raid. So, of course, what we wanted to make sure people understood was that there was a real distinction between those who planned the raid and those who fought in it, and we wanted to give voices to both. And of course, in making sure that people understand this comes from a combined operations mindset, we make sure that people understand that there's a naval component, quite small, 250 total, and as well as, of course, an air component, which contrasted with the German Luftwaffe component, which is below here. The German Air Force was 313 aircraft and a 5% loss rate, whereas we had a 4% loss rate. So from the perspective of the aerial battle, it was actually a little bit more successful than the rest of the operation. But one of the aspects too that we kept in mind was making sure that we would cover the international representation in the Dieppe Raid by highlighting some of the contributions beyond the Canadians, of course, with this highly international deck, as you can see here. Of course, the Dieppe Raid is predominantly Canadian, but with British, American, and Free French forces, and also anti-Nazi enemy nationals, 5 of them actually, that we wanted to make sure. So with a total of 6,000 troops being involved. What we cover for the raid itself through a gigantic map and some photographs is the difference again between the plan and the reality. So the objectives are made clear to visitors. It was to test defenses, to destroy these defenses, take prisoners of war, pinch and capture intelligence documents. What unfolded in the reality, however, and we use some soldier quotes that are quite harsh to make sure people understand that this was a complete disaster. Of course, the reality makes it that it's a failure right away due to a really rigid plan that resulted in some lateness and difficulties in navigating tanks to come ashore. The momentum is completely lost, and the surprise effect that was supposed to be in place, as well as the smoke screen that was supposed to protect the oncoming landing force being dissipated, makes it a complete inferno. And the fact that there was no large gun support from the ships also did not help in trying to gain some fire support from the beaches. So we end up having a disaster where some of the tanks don't all make it ashore, and those who do are neutralized right away. what ends up happening is that the tanks offer cover for the infantry that is desperate. I wanted to highlight a quote by, we do have some German content in the exhibition. This is one of them. As the landing ramps fell and the attackers sprang onto land, they met the destructive fire of 2 heavy machine guns. An inferno began, which was to last almost 3 hours. In our post, 2 young soldiers who had only been here a few days threw up constantly. It was their first action. We were amazed at the attacker, who fought with bravery against an opponent who could not be seen. Taking cover behind their dead comrades, they shot uninterruptedly at our positions. Thus, with their dead bodies, these dead soldiers provided their comrades with the last service of friendship. So I think this German account makes visitors understand the brutality of the fighting. Some of the infographics in this section are probably with our British visitors in mind, who know a lot about the Somme usually, or know some to some extent of July 1st, 1916. Here we compare the Royal Regiment of Canada at Puy with the Newfoundland Regiment at Beaumont-Hamel on July 1st, 1916. What you're interested in seeing here is the loss rate in percentages. So the Newfoundland Regiment losses were sitting at 85%, where the Royal Regiment of Canada was at 94% loss rate. So making sure, again, that the disaster is explained through a variety of means. One of the challenges that we created for ourselves is wishing to have a Spitfire engine to represent, to give a size of the scale of just what an engine looks like from a Spitfire. We couldn't get a Spitfire inside the exhibition, of course, but this is a highlight of the exhibition. We also were lucky enough to get a really great loan from the Canadian War Museum. It's the pigeon message copy that was sent by Lieutenant Colonel Macbeth back to England when the orders came to abandon the mission and retreat. A quite moving artifact that we have in the exhibition. Okay, so that leads me to our third zone of the exhibition, the propaganda, and I'll go through various layers of propaganda here. First of all, our own Allied propaganda, and then German, as well as French propaganda. So a key thing in doing the research for this exhibition was discovering the work of Timothy Balzer, and we used this quote to make it clear in visitors' minds that the outcome of the raid had been written in advance, regardless of the raid's outcome. So you can't get any closer to propaganda than this analysis, of course. And what unfolds in Canada is a brutal story of disaster. We have a great quote here where Ross Munro, who was correspondent for the Canadian press and present at the raid, reported back to the Canadian public at great length after the raid. And his way of describing the raid is, even though there's censor rules in place at the time, I think he applies a certain level of self-censor when he describes the Dieppe Raid. He says Dieppe was a disaster and a triumph. It was a defeat and a conquest. It was tragic, yet it brought forth such shining gallantry from 5,000 Canadians new to battle that their courage and audacity electrified the world's free people. Dieppe became a watchword for gallant conduct on every Allied war front. So the word disaster is there, but failure certainly not. So the story that unfolds in Canada is that the lists and of missing, wounded, and prisoners and killed begin to be listed in newspapers, and they take pages and pages, whereas the headlines, you know, are fairly positive. So that clashes completely. You know, Toronto men played full part in historic battle. So again, there's a dissonance between what the Canadian public is fed as headlines and these brutal casualty lists that are printed. Another aspect that another quote that was quite touching for the exhibition was finding the words and the letters that families wrote to the Canadian government. We discovered through a great friend of the Juno Beach Center, Larry O'Malley, who gave us hours of research in letters written after the Dieppe Raid, and this is probably one of the most touching ones that we could feature. I will not read it because I can't emotionally, actually. And just to keep going with our infographics in the exhibition, some of the losses encountered are quite shocking, especially for the towns. That was another way to showcase the ripple effect of the Dieppe Raid in the towns and cities across Canada, where, you know, overnight a city has like Toronto and Hamilton are the hardest hit, obviously. But if we compare this to let's say casualty lists and war dead lists from our time during the Afghanistan war, this pales in comparison, and it's something so brutal to awaken to for the Canadian public in Canada. This is a great artifact that comes from the Essex and Kent Scottish Regimental Museum, a large print, impressive to see in person. Great artifact in the exhibition where you see crowds of thousands of families of those who fought, who gathered to listen to Ross Munro telling the story of the Dieppe Raid, of the bravery. Ross Munro was one of the few to have firsthand accounts retrieved back from the men who escaped back to England, of course. So he did a series of these speaking events across Canada. He also did one in Montreal in Parc La Fontaine, who was well attended. About 4,000 people gathered. So there was a real interest in discovering what had happened to the Fusiliers Mont-Royal in Montreal as well. And of course, in making sure we present this exhibition also to a French audience, which is the highest percentage of our visitors at the Juno Beach Center are French people. We described quite a bit what had happened to the French during the Dieppe Raid. We should note here that there was actually 46 civilians who were killed during the raid due to bombardments and aerial fighting and the destruction. The city was in flames and fire. And of course, life under Nazi occupation for the French meant that during the raid, French civilians were really scared of, they wanted to interact with the Canadians, especially with the prisoners of war that they saw. They wanted to help them out, but they were in fear of retaliation, which essentially consisted of deportation to concentration camps or executions. So the population was under an immense amount of pressure. And of course, there was a lot of interactions between civilians and Canadians shortly thereafter the fighting. The quote here gives a sense of the fear of reprisals from the Germans, but it was clear at the time that this was only a helping hand. We have a moment in the exhibition where a soldier also interacts with a French civilian who's a child, and he promises to be back, essentially. So I'll close with the French propaganda with this incident that is not as well known in Canada as it is in France. But essentially what happened after the Dieppe Raid is that Hitler wanted to personally himself thank the population of Dieppe for not having helped the Canadians during the raid. Of course, this was untrue. It's not that they didn't want to help the Canadians, it's that they feared if they helped the Canadians of the retaliation, as I was explaining. So the initial thank you came as the proposition of a monetary reward given to the mayor of Dieppe of actually 10,000 francs at the time. The mayor, who was walking a thin line, actually refused the reward from Hitler and negotiated the return of his prisoners of war from Dieppe from the fall of France in 1940. And I'll get back to that later on as we talk about the memory of the raid in Zone 5. But it's a twisted way of manipulating the population, of trying to seduce the population, which goes back to the previous poster, which says, you know, like abandoned populations, referring to the Allies abandoning Western Europe, you know, trust the German soldier. But I'll get back to that later. Another great discovery in the research for the exhibition was the propaganda posters that were created for occupied parts of the Nazi Reich, the Third Reich. So occupied Lithuania here gets the story of Dieppe through the lens of the failure, of course. Same here with a propaganda poster in Polish, destined to occupied Poland, which was a really neat discovery in the exhibition. And then I'll take the time to, it's kind of funny at the same time, it's a fairly clear analysis of Canadians at the time, but this is a German perspective on the Canadian soldiers. From a propaganda leaflet distributed across Germany, which stated most of them are haggard men, referring to the Canadian soldiers, not quite young anymore, men with rough faces, athletic builds, who volunteered for the dangerous landing, the type of men you met in Port Town or a bar in the city or the villages of the Canadian Midwest, and who terrorized peaceful citizens everywhere. In short, roughnecks and ruffians who don't know what to do with their excess energy. These boys aren't lacking in courage, but the hell on the beach at Dieppe proved too much even for their nerves. The war for England promised them easy money, pretty girls, adventure, and combat, of which they were not afraid, but not senseless and hopeless sacrifice. So, of course, the raid in Germany is presented as a complete failure, the failure of a second front, the failure of an actual landing to liberate Europe, etc. So that leads me to the zone on captivity, which we really wanted to feature as an important part of the Dieppe experience. Again, the ripple effect of Dieppe, the experiences of captivity for the bulk of the force, actually. This was actually on the good advice of having some great conversations with the Canadian War Museum, actually, who was just very collaborative with us and having some good conversations about including those realities and making sure to dive into that topic as much as we could, or as the space allowed. So we created infographics to show the routes that Canadians took towards occupied Czech Republic and Poland and Germany to enter the stalags, as well as what you see on the left of the screen are the famous death marches of the spring of 1945, which all the POWs experienced during months on end, which created some malnutrition issues and some health issues for often cases of the rest of their lives. So one aspect that we cover are who dies in captivity, which actually there's 72 POWs who don't make it past the death marches during the spring of 1945. And a great quote by Jack Polton, who says, "You can train a soldier to fight, you can train a soldier to accept death, but there's no way to prepare a soldier to be taken prisoner. The experience can only be understood by one who has been through the humiliation." Again, in the captivity section, we use some fairly emotional quotes, again, to showcase the brutality of being far away from home and missing home and needing news from home, which is so central to the POW experience. This brings me to the shackling issue, which some of you might know about. We do mention, I should say in passing, the presence of Foote, Captain Reverend the Padre Foote, who chose to go into captivity with his men from the Rileys, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. We do mention him in the exhibition. I just wanted to mention that in passing because he's such a key figure to the captivity period. But back to the shackling issue. This comes from Allied orders to shackle any German prisoners of war made that are found on actually Brigadier Southam, who's in charge of 6th Brigade, so the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, the South Saskatchewan Regiment, and the Reserve Unit, the FMR, the Fusiliers Mont-Royal. So what ends up happening is that as a result of finding these orders, the Germans decide to retaliate, and they shackled Canadian prisoners of war in Germany from September 1942 every day until November 1943, which is 14 months of that brutal treatment. In Canada, some of you might know that the same happens, but a much shorter period for 3 months from September 42 to November 42. It results also in one of the officers' camp in Canada, German officer camp in Canada in Bowmanville, Ontario, which results in a riot that lasts almost 3 days, where the prisoners are creating havoc to refuse to be shackled, essentially, and the shackling ends after this riot in Canada. One of the great quotes too that goes to show the psychological effects of living in captivity is that here, described by Lieutenant Colonel Fred Jasperson, who's prisoner of war, who notices that the young people seem to have less patience than older chaps such as himself to deal with prison life. As far as psychological scars, it should be noted, and we talk about this in the exhibition, that the Dieppe Prisoners of War Association began a fight that lasted a number of years, fighting for compensation for psychological and physical scars due to captivity, in lengthy captivity, 3 years. And that compensation was finally granted in 1976, which is quite late. Okay. Let's see. Oh, during captivity, there is a one moment when, just a couple more factoids, I guess, about this. During the early stages of captivity, the Germans were quite well aware that there were tensions in Canada between French and English Canadians, and they actually separated for a while the French from the English Canadians, and they put a fence between them, and they started to distribute chocolates only to the French Canadians to try to raise anger between the two camps. And it actually did not work. Eventually, what happened is that the French Canadians tried to give the chocolate back to the English Canadians. So it was a great moment of solidarity in Canadian history that might not be well known in our two solitudes, but it happened in the early stages of captivity. I wanted to recount that. And of course, there's another isolated event, but it goes to show that the Germans had their eyes set on Canada and Quebec. They wanted to seduce Quebec through the French Vichy government, and they organized the return through the French Red Cross, which was under Vichy at the time. They organized the return of FMR prisoners of war to Quebec to try to seduce the Quebec population at the time. So yeah, just another aspect that is worth mentioning. Before I dive into the last section of the exhibition, which ties into the title of the exhibition, From Dieppe to Juno, is there such a thing as, you know, as we often tend to believe in Canadian military history, that there is a direct relationship between Dieppe and the Normandy landings, where lives lost during the Dieppe raid ended up saving lives during the Normandy landings. We really dive into that topic and trying to make sure that people understand it's not such a straightforward path or such a clear path from Dieppe to D-Day. Of course, we have maps that showcase other important amphibious operations that occur after Dieppe and before Normandy, where the lessons learned are key to making sure that the Normandy landings are a complete success. Namely, of course, the Operation Torch in North Africa in 1942 in November. We also have Sicily and Italy in July and September of 1943. So an Operation Shingle in January of 1945, which contribute to giving the Allies much experience in amphibious operations at larger scales. And here we also make sure that people really distinguish between a landing and a raid in size and scope, with some figures and statistics that show clearly that the raid is so small compared to the Normandy landings, but also that the landing is meant to be the bringing of a second front, the bringing of a solid bridgehead to commence the liberation of Europe. So one of the we'll talk here a little bit about the lessons learned, of course, with the Dieppe raid, but one of the key aspects of the lessons learned is that artificial ports and the notion of having artificial ports in Normandy or in the second front opening amphibiously is an idea, it's a concept that actually precedes Dieppe. It was actually Churchill in April of 1942 who started to make sure the engineers would begin thinking about ways to bring artificial ports to areas of France that had no deep water ports, which is what Normandy is famous for. It has no deep water ports. The deep water ports, as we discovered during the Dieppe raid, are well too fortified to be attacked amphibiously. It's not worth it. But that notion, again, it doesn't come from Dieppe. It precedes Dieppe, as artificial ports were in the thinking before August 19th, 1942. Arguably, what is the lesson learned is that Dieppe brings a lot of emphasis on the lack of a close tank, infantry, and artillery coordination that we will, of course, see during the Juno Beach landings, and quite a success. The funnies, Hobart's funnies during the D-Day landings are quite critical to victory and success in the first few hours of the landing. So I'll now move on towards the very last section of the museum, which deals with memory. We have, of course, a bit of a healing moment in all this disaster history, this scar in our mental, in our collective memory of the Second World War. It's the return to Dieppe, the famous promise made at the time that we would be back. We are back after the Battle of Normandy, and we liberate Dieppe quite poignantly, symbolically, returning to Dieppe, where some of the soldiers who fought on D-Day in the Battle of Normandy are there to honor their fallen comrades from 1942 as well. Some must have been just completely amazing to actually be there. And the French civilians were actually in a really heightened state of joy to welcome the Canadians again, this time for real, for long. And one of the aspects I wanted to cover again is that return to Dieppe. In September of 1944, we have a great artifact, a beautiful handmade flag that was given to the 2nd Infantry Canadian Division by the prisoners of war of Dieppe. So those I was referring to earlier, who had the chance to come home after the Dieppe raid as a result of a propaganda maneuver between the Germans and the French, felt an immense sense of guilt and debt to the Canadians, and the fact that they had the luxury to come home based on the fact that so many Canadians were killed that day was not something that sat well with them. Of course, they're happy to be home, but it came at a bittersweet, it left a bittersweet impression on them for the rest of their lives. So a really moving artifact here. So it brings us to some of the final words I want to bring to your attention with regards to Dieppe and what we cover in the exhibition. One quote that I only have a few more quotes for you. This one was one of my favorite ones that really goes to show the extreme isolation that some of these veterans felt after the war. It's an anonymous testimony from an FMR soldier who says much later after the war, when we met at the Legion, there we only spoke about the war, but with civilians, no. Even when you want to tell something to a civilian who has never been, first of all, he won't believe you. Second of all, he'll tell you, you didn't have to go. I felt isolated. So I think that really goes to show some of the psychological impact, those famous ripples I was describing to you at the beginning of the presentation we wanted to showcase to visitors. We end the exhibition on a few final key points. The fact that it occupies such a large space in our collective memory, as Tim Cook says at the beginning of the exhibition. So Dieppe, Falaise, Ortona, Caen are right up there as clouds above Vimy Ridge. This is actually from 1946, published in the Globe and Mail. And if we fast forward to 2006, a great artifact from the Canadian War Museum's collections, actually. It's a protest sign used during a peace march during the Pan-Canadian Day of Action called Troops Out of Afghanistan Now, which shows, you know, the suicidal missions described as Kandahar, Dieppe, and Beaumont Hamel. A final thing, the CVSM, the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal with the Dieppe class, finally came in 1991. which is really late to have anything, because Dieppe veterans suffered the fact that they didn't have a campaign medal for their service. There was no indication in their medals that they had served at Dieppe or survived Dieppe. And they had to put up a fight to get that Dieppe, that famous Dieppe bar added to their CVSM, and it was finally established in 1991, which shows again a ripple effect or a continuing scar in one section that's quite moving in the exhibition is the famous video created in 2008 by Bell Canada. I don't have the copyrights to show it to you from one end to another, but most Canadians are quite familiar with this. In fact, in negotiating the copyrights for the segment with the company that created it, and also with Bell Canada, Bell told us that year after year, every year, more Canadians ask to rerun this ad. It's so popular. So it's for those who might have not seen it, it's a conversation between the grandson and a grandfather. Grandson is visiting the beaches of Dieppe. So for our European visitors who know nothing about this, this encapsulates it, and they really realize that, wow, okay, Dieppe is such an important part of our Canadian story. So I will end on a couple of quotes for my last words with you tonight before we go into questions. 80 years after Dieppe, I think we still are face to face with the limits of our abilities to offer explanations to the Dieppe Raid, like Brian Loring Villa said. And to quote the son of a soldier killed at Dieppe, was Dieppe a useless sacrifice? Modestly, I do not wish to answer. I would not want my father, who believed in his duty to be there, to have died unnecessarily. So I will end with that and guide you to perhaps take the time to go on our website and visit our educational resources on the Dieppe Raid, which is the closest thing we have to a catalog of the exhibition online. And I want to also end with thank you to all the Canadian museums who helped us bring artifacts over to France to tell this Canadian story. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and thank you so much for listening to me for over 50 minutes, I think, by now.
Well, actually, you just came in just under 50 minutes. And it was absolutely fascinating. I must admit, those who might notice, I actually have tears in my eyes, so I was busy trying to wipe them away. There's just something about that. It was something about that Bell video, because I remembered it, and so it immediately triggered, and I thought, what a good timing for that to happen. Anyway, folks, what I'm going to tell you now is that I'm going to kind of monitor who's out there trying to ask questions. I would ask you to please unmute yourself and go to the more button that's in the top of your screens, usually on the right hand side. You'll find the little raise hand button, and it will go from there. So that's our intention. And we have a coordinator online who should be able, hopefully I'll get everybody's videos up here shortly so that we can see everyone who's online. So I'm going to just, hopefully that will all miraculously happen now, that we'll be able to have everybody showing. So with a little luck, or those who've got their video off, I guess we won't have that. But anyway, let's have a look here with gallery view and see what I got. Perfect. So I'll just start looking for some hands if I can. And when I see one, I'm going to just move along here and see what we see. Still looking for some hands here. And I do know that Tom, you wanted to ask some questions, so I'm going to give you the first run here. If you're there somewhere, Tom, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Louise. Yes, that was an excellent presentation. Would you be able to compare how the government and the media presented the Dieppe Raid with how perhaps a similar operation might be presented these days? Because it looks, from what you were saying, like there was a certain degree of covering up of the reality.
Yes, absolutely. No, you're right. Um, it's really quite disturbing to discover that the outcome of regardless of the outcome of the raid, that the raid would be presented as a success. That is pure propaganda. And can you rephrase your question? You wanted to compare to today?
Oh, no, I was just wondering, my feeling is that in today's day and age, supposing that there was a similar catastrophe in our operation in Afghanistan, that the government wouldn't have had the option of presenting it as either a great success or at least not a dismal failure.
Well, of course, today we are in charge of our own military, even more so than we were during the Second World War, arguably. So this was a combined operations event, and the public relations of combined operations was more powerful at the time, informing how the Canadian public would, the policy came from that, from the top. And of course, that probably didn't help in bringing anti-British sentiment in the Canadian military at the time. I should note that in one of the last sections of the exhibition, we quote Curator, who actually was summoned to attend a meeting with officials in London on September 2nd, 1944, the famous day when Canadians are back in Dieppe after the Battle of Normandy. And he actually refused to go. He disobeyed orders and he wanted to be in Dieppe with the Canadians. And he was interviewed by an American journalist, because he was on the cover of the Times magazine actually in September 1944. And the American journalist is quite astute in picking up in that anti-British sentiment in the Canadian forces at the time. And he asks, why didn't he go to that meeting and why did he choose to be in Dieppe with his men? And Crewar's answer is, I have about 800 reasons to be in Dieppe today. He's referring to the amount of Canadian war dead in that cemetery. So I don't know if that gives you a bit of an answer to your question. I might be drifting off into another really complex topic of British-Canadian relations during the Second World War, but yeah.
Yes, we could have a lot of fun with that topic.
Yeah.
But thank you very much. I very much look forward to getting to the Juno Beach Center someday.
I hope you make it over. It's should be on every Canadian's bucket list.
I agree.
I would be curious to find out what kind of feedback you're getting on the exhibit by your visitors. What kind of thing, is there some common themes you're getting?
So far, what's really sad is that Canadian travel hasn't resumed in ways that we were expecting it to come back. And so we're still low on Canadian numbers, but that's made up by local travel. There's been a burst in European travel to the Juno Beach Center, and they seem to really appreciate it. I was talking to the director of the museum last week, and she says we keep getting positive comments from European visitors, so that's a good sign. But we haven't welcomed large groups of Canadians yet to speak of that so far. Yeah.
Okay. I also found it really, I think some of these veteran issues, the fact that they didn't get their medal, their bar for service until 1991, a lot of the facts that you provided today are really fascinating in relation to the veteran community that I sometimes deal with at the Pearly. So giving me these other little bits of information will be most useful in those kind of conversations, because that veteran community often speaks about things that things that have bothered them in the past in their relationships with the Canadian government and Veterans Affairs. So I found that absolutely fascinating. I noticed that I'm not getting a whole bunch of hands going up for questions. that might have more to do with the fact that that you've just provided us so much information. But I will just one more offering out there. If someone just wants to unmute themselves and maybe was having trouble with the chat button in hand, are more than welcome to unmute and just speak up if they would like. Aha, so I see another hand come up from the Friends of the War Museum, so go ahead.
Sorry, it's me again.
Yes, Tom.
Louise's comment brought this to mind. Are you aware, was there ever an effective after action process in terms of looking at flaws and problems, or internally to the military, was it covered up just as badly and they all pretended it was a great success and moved on? Like, did they actually try to learn anything from the debacle?
Well, yeah, no, there was a debacle. We might remember here that Roberts, who was that I didn't bring up on my screen in my slides, but Roberts was eventually sacked. He actually retired to the Jersey Islands, Guernsey and Jersey Islands in the 1950s, even left Canada. So there was much afterthought given to this, and the chain of command ended up using Roberts as a scapegoat. And I think a lot of Canadian historians have spent much more time on this than I have. So I'm not an expert on the question, but Roberts comes to mind right away, and the fact that he was sacked and used as a scapegoat for sure. Yeah.
Well, since I don't seem to see any more questions, I would certainly like to, on behalf of the collective who's here this evening, to thank you very much. I think getting this from a curator's perspective, we particularly love that at the Friends of the War Museum. We've had the curator's perspectives in the past on the second line supply boxes and the Highlander exhibit that we've had. So it has a special meaning for us as between the Friends of the War Museum to really understand that curator and education aspect. So thank you ever so much. And it's particularly kind of you because I know you did a major presentation yesterday as well to another organization. So the fact that you're willing to do this two evenings in a row is truly appreciated by this community of practice. I would also remind you all that we have more presentations coming over the next few months. We have a presentation this September. I'm not sure whether it'll be both virtual and in person at the museum, or whether it'll just be virtual. But we do have a speaker coming in to talk about the Canadian experience in Iceland during the Second World War. In particular, regiments like the Cameron Highlanders were sent there. The Royal Regiment of Canada was sent there. So it'll be a very interesting part of it. And I have been to Iceland and I have seen some of the buildings that were built there. And I always wondered a bit what was going on. So to find out that there was Canadian participation there is particularly interesting. So that'll be for September. October, we're looking for another presentation, hopefully on sort of from a perspective of Ukraine and Russia, and from a professor from RMC, on sort of all of this issue and some of the things that are happening today as relation to Ukraine. And then we're also looking in November for in particular a presentation from the Canadian military community, intelligence community, on a recent bit of history that's been gathered for them. So all that to say, we have some interesting times coming, and hopefully you'll come back and see us again for September, October, and November. And so on behalf of the collective, I'll thank you all for being here this evening and hope to see you again. And should you want to tell someone about this presentation, it will go up on our friend's site as well. So it's there and recorded for someone if they want to watch it. Thanks again, everyone.
I just wanted to, I just saw a comment. Sorry if I can indulge, because I know once I hang up, I'm going to think of a million things I wanted to tell you, but I see somebody who wrote in regards to the potential pinch operation motivated and driven by none other than Ian Fleming to retrieve a naval enigma and its secrets. You have part of the Dieppe displays dedicated to this. Do you in fact have a Kriegsmarine enigma on display to complement this point? So this is one thing I want to answer to Richard and everyone that's interested. Yes, we do. We did have a Kriegsmarine enigma on display for a few months. We were lucky to have a loan for a couple of months, but we can't have it for the duration of the show. And with regards to David O'Keefe's latest work on this whole issue and how popular it's become, what we chose to do in the exhibition was to not necessarily say that there was in fact, or affirm that there was in fact an Enigma machine in Dieppe, and that was the sole, purpose of the raid. But we do bring out the connection to the Battle of the Atlantic, and we do bring out the connection to the Naval Intelligence War. And I think that's partially due to David O'Keefe's work, of course, but at the same time, as a museum, and the Canadian War Museum is familiar with this sort of standpoint where you showcase the history for people to choose, but you don't necessarily take a side, or so we do showcase that aspect in the exhibition, but we don't go as far as affirming the entire theories. I think time will tell, and research is ongoing. So, and it has to be something that is accepted by the whole of the community. But that our choice was to really give a context to the exhibition, and that was certainly due to the work that he's done. So I just wanted to add that, because I would have felt bad for Richard, who posed that question. I just saw it. And I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much again for your attention.